When the Indian army steps out, Bollywood steps in. Some overpaid hero who can make a grand total of maybe 3 facial expressions is dressed in army fatigues. He's paired up with another overpaid actress who you can also see is trying really hard to act. Together, they make a blockbuster action movie gunning down Pakistani terrorists and soldiers who all seem to have this obsessive compulsive disorder of starting every sentence with Janab this and Janab that. So successful has this formula been that the words Operation Sindoor were trademarked within days of the conflict, and it was only after a national uproar that it was withdrawn and blamed on a junior person without authorization. But this time it calls for a different movie, because this time it wasn't just a battle of fighter jets and drones. The battle also spread to the economy. In the middle of the conflict, the IMF was scheduled to approve the next installment of its loan package to Pakistan. And what was supposed to be a routine procedure quickly escalated into a geopolitical flashpoint. India ratcheted up its criticism of the IMF, saying that look, in the last 35 years, Pakistan has survived 28 of them using IMF bailout loans. In fact, in the last 5 years alone, there has been 4 IMF bailouts. Isn't this a bit too much? This constant drip feed of bailout money for decades has essentially been rewarding continued sponsorship of cross-border terrorism, with India pointing out to the IMF that every time it gives a loan to Pakistan, there has been increased arms procurement that year. Even though this time the loan installment got passed, it seems now that India is going after the money. There are reports that India will now ask the World Bank to reconsider its $20 billion package to Pakistan. It is also looking to approach the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, that monitors money laundering and terror financing, to put Pakistan back on the grey list, which would make it difficult for it to get foreign investment and assistance. I mean, they should just make a movie with balding economists, central bankers, finance ministry officials, diplomats, all shuffling around with reports, having closed door meetings and sealing deals. By the way, I need royalty if someone ever decides to make such a movie. And so, let's talk about Pakistan's economy. What's gone wrong? Why does it have to rely on IMF loans so much? And where is it headed? Hello and welcome to The Bond Economist, your one-stop destination for professional advice on the economy. My name is Aurodeep Nandi, and today we talk about Pakistan's economy and its addiction to IMF bailouts. As always, if you like what you see, please do subscribe, and if you'd like to contribute to my channel, feel free to hover your phone over this QR code or use the super thanks button below. First things first, what's the deal with IMF bailouts? Well, the IMF is a bit like a clinic for sick countries. So when are countries sick? Well, crisis can come in many forms, but the two most common types are one where the government can no longer afford to run the country. If it's spending too fast and not collecting enough revenues from taxes and other sources, the country's borrowings become unsustainable and the debt blows up and no one is ready to lend to the country anymore. The other situation is a balance of payments crisis. The country is spending too much of its forex every day on imports, but not enough of that forex is returning back through exports, remittances, and foreign investments. So on a net basis, the country is leaking dollars and its forex reserves keep shrinking until it can barely afford a few weeks of imports. More often than not, the reason behind the fiscal and the balance of payment crisis are years of bad governance, years of abuse of the economy, and then one major economic shock tumbles all the dominoes at one go. And Pakistan ticks all these boxes. You don't even have to individually think and tick. You can just scratch one line across all the boxes. Low growth, high inflation, high fiscal deficit, high current account deficit, crumbling institutions, widespread corruption. It's like someone wanted to design a sample country for an IMF bailout. So how does the IMF generally help? Well, it steps in with a sizable bailout loan designed to stabilize the economy, to give some breathing space to the government, to signal to foreign creditors and investors that look, things are under control. And they have different assistance programs, each have different terms and conditions. In the case of Pakistan, IMF has clarified that the money is directly going to the central bank's reserves and the government is not allowed to use it for their budget. So technically, this money can't be used to buy weapons, for instance. Very importantly, the IMF money comes with terms and conditions attached. The loan is given in installments and is conditional on the country undertaking tough reforms that it has avoided so far. So it's the equivalent of an economic rehab. So why has Pakistan been in the rehab for so long? Ironically, the core reason behind Pakistan's constant state of crisis is curiously absent in the hundreds of pages of IMF staff reports, and that is who is actually running the country. In Pakistan, the military is the ultimate puppet master, not just on defense, but also on politics, on foreign policy, and on the economy. It is an open secret that no Pakistani civilian government can survive without the approval of the military. The rise and fall of the previous Prime Minister Imran Khan is testament to how the same military that can lay out the red carpet can also pull it under your feet if they don't like you. The Pakistani military also runs a vast business empire. A 2020 UNDP report calls it the largest conglomerate of business entities and the biggest urban real estate developer in Pakistan. Take, for instance, the Fauji Foundation, a behemoth conglomerate that is spread over industries like fertilizer, cement, food, power, gas, financial services, security. Similarly, the Army Welfare Trust operates some 18 corporate entities. The Defense Housing Authorities control prime real estate in major cities. The Pakistan Army-run Frontier Works Organization is also a major construction player. You know, it's interesting. Pakistan set up the Special Investment Facilitation Council, SIFC, to create a single window for investors, coordinate between government departments, fast-track projects. Now, in any other country, this kind of setup would probably be led by the Prime Minister or some key ministers. In Pakistan, the Chief of Army Staff, now Field Marshal Asim Munir, sits on this council. Can you imagine in India if we had the Chief of Army Staff getting involved in IKEA setting up another store or Google opening another office? And this military overhang on the economy has come at a cost. Do watch the speech Asim Munir gave to the Overseas Pakistanis Convention sometime before the Pahalgam terrorist attack. It was a packed auditorium, everyone there to listen to the de facto leader of the country. He could have talked about how Pakistan is getting over its economic problems. He could have talked about reforms that they were undertaking. He could have talked about his vision for the country. Instead, his speech was about how Hindus are different from Muslims.
We are different from the Hindus in every possible aspect of life. Foundation of the two-nation theory that was laid there. That we are two nations. We are not one nation.
I mean, seriously, it's now close to 80 years since we have been partitioned. If that is still your core speaking point, then your forward vision is very backward looking. And then he followed this up with how they are resisting against the Indian Army, how Kashmir is Pakistan's jugular vein, how they are cracking down on Balochistan, and this weird pride as if Pakistan is fighting some kind of war for Islam.
जो कुरान में उसका नाम है यसरब या अहले यसरिबा ला मुकाम लकुम फरजिउ, ये कुरान में नाम है उसका, जो आज जिसको मदीना अल मुनव्वरा कहा जाता है. और दूसरी रियासत जो है वो उसके 1300 साल के बाद अल्लाह ताला ने ये आपकी बनाई है.
Pakistan's morbid fascination with its military, with Kashmir, with its Islamic identity has come at the cost of proper governance and economic management. Democratic processes no longer work, government institutions stand compromised, policies are inconsistent, and the political system has gotten hijacked by vested interests. This includes feudal landlords who own vast tracts of land, political dynasties, power brokers, religious and extremist groups, business elites, industrial cartels. They have all grabbed political power and, like a mafia, have subverted the economy so that it only works for them and not for the country as a whole. So, how have they managed to do this? Well, by sucking the economy dry. For years, they've hollowed out Pakistan's tax base by getting lower tax rates, getting more tax exemptions, and straight out evading taxes. Their companies and enterprises were given access to cheap energy, water, machinery, land, infrastructure, and subsidies. Meanwhile, the government was bullied into ensuring that they get higher output prices. Pakistan also runs a behemoth state-owned enterprises sector, or PSUs, public sector units, as we like to call it in India. These span over many sectors, make huge amounts of losses for which the government ultimately picks up the bill. The UNDP estimated that these benefits and privileges amounted to over 7% of Pakistan's GDP as of 2017-18. Not to mention that so much power in the hands of so few has led to rent seeking and patronage, making corruption and red tape a serious issue in Pakistan. So what happens when you pamper the elites in this way? Well, you create a very unproductive economy. When you look at Pakistan's growth drivers, two things become very clear. One, over the last couple of decades, the grey bar, capital, has shrunk. So investment levels have been dropping. And two, the red bar, productivity or innovation, has also shrunk massively. And you see the direct impact of this on Pakistan's exports. That red line in the chart is Pakistan's export sector. And you can see it's virtually stagnated, in sharp contrast to other Asian economies, including India, who have built their fortunes on the export of sophisticated goods and services. And by the way, what is Pakistan exporting? Majorly just two categories: textile goods, the blue bar, and the agricultural goods, the red bar. So while other countries have diversified their export basket, take India for example, we have petroleum products, chemicals, pharma, auto, textiles, mobile phones, engineering goods, not to mention our behemoth IT and knowledge services economy, which support hundreds of thousands of formal and informal jobs. Pakistan is still stuck with exporting clothes and crops. And influential textile and pharma lobbies have ensured that most of the government support continues to get diverted to these sectors. So the scope for other sectors to flourish gets capped. And then there is the mess that is Pakistan's power sector. Now, around a couple of decades back, Pakistan made a disastrous decision. To encourage private investment in the power generation business, the government offered what was known as take or pay contracts. Basically, the government said, don't worry, regardless of whether we need electricity from you or not, we will continue to pay you. It's like when you book a hotel room. It's up to you whether you want to spend the whole day in it, or just a few hours, or spend the whole day outside the hotel. The hotel gets paid for the full day. At that point, Pakistan was going through major power cuts. The public sector generation companies were just too inefficient. And so this was a desperate move to attract fresh investment. So the publicly run distribution companies got saddled with these commitments. But where will they get the money to pay these private power generation companies? Well, ideally they would charge customers, Pakistani households, industries and businesses. But over the years, the government ignored investing in transmission, in distribution, in power management, in tariff collection. So there was low bill recovery and widespread theft of electricity. So then the distribution companies would go to the government and say, hey, we are not getting money from our customers. We need subsidies from you to pay for these fixed costs from contracts that you got us to sign with these generation companies. But the government was in deep financial stress, so it would postpone paying these subsidies. So then the distribution companies would go and tell the power generation companies, look, too bad, we don't have the money to pay what you are contractually owed. So now the generation companies who import coal and gas are unable to pay their suppliers. Maintenance in the power sector would get deferred, services would decline, and Pakistan would continue to face power cuts. And so eventually the government would have to step in, borrow money and relieve the players in the system, and then the same vicious cycle would continue. There's a term for it in Pakistan called circular debt. The power sector is currently sitting on around 2.2% of GDP worth of this debt. A slightly different but broadly similar kind of mess is also there in the gas sector, which has run up a circular debt of 2.7% of GDP as per IMF estimates. So you can imagine how difficult it is to keep lights and kitchens running in Pakistan when the government is already having to deal with nearly 5% of GDP worth of debt in this sector. In the past couple of years, the IMF has been forcing Pakistan to raise electricity tariffs. And at one point, Bloomberg reported that electricity bills overtook rent costs for some in Pakistan. And electricity is such a fundamental input for growth. If you screw up power, you will inevitably screw up growth. So how have all of this impacted the macroeconomics of Pakistan? Well, Pakistan's GDP has virtually stagnated. You can see how dramatically better its peers are doing. And this has had real consequences for the population. Pakistan ranks in the bottom globally in terms of per capita income, has one of the lowest levels of adult literacy, lowest levels of primary enrollment, high levels of infant mortality, and high levels of stunting. So this is when children are unable to grow in pace with their age in the early years and then risk having chronic health problems. In 2023, inflation reached record highs. There was catastrophic food shortage and there were protests and riots on the streets. Most educated, well-to-do Pakistanis, the small minority that represents the precious little human capital the country still possesses, is trying desperately to get out of the country, making the growth situation even worse. By the way, Pakistan's Field Marshal Asim Munir, in all his wisdom, feels that this is not an issue.
Representing our country in every nook and corner of the world, is this the brain drain? And if this is the brain drain, then we would like to continue with this brain drain for an indefinite period of time.
It's not funny how this is not a joke. Meanwhile, with the economy stagnating, the government not collecting enough taxes, the government having no control over spending, and the country getting into incessant fights on all sides, India, Afghanistan, Iran, all of this has led to Pakistan running a high fiscal deficit. To fund this gap between expenditure and revenues, the Pakistani government has racked up debts from around 60% of GDP a decade back to nearly 80% of GDP in 2023, after which they finally managed to get it down a bit. And where has Pakistan been borrowing from? Until a few years back, the government would basically bully the central bank to buy its own bonds, which is basically tantamount to printing money, which is a formula for creating uncontrollable inflation. The government has recently stopped this practice, but here's the thing. Pakistani banks are now buying most of the government bonds instead of the central bank. And they are lending so much to the government that bank lending to the private sector has been cascading down, which in turn also leads to lower growth. And then there is the external crisis. On the one hand, Pakistan doesn't export enough, specializing only in textiles and agri-goods. Meanwhile, Pakistan is paying through its nose for imports of oil, gas, food, and the expensive tastes of its elite. So, if exports are weak, imports are high, then Pakistan's only sources of dollars are A, foreign investment, which aren't coming, and B, remittances from Pakistanis abroad, which currently is the only saving grace for their country. So overall, the economy is bleeding dollars, the currency depreciates, and foreign exchange reserves keep getting depleted. Enter foreign lenders like IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and countries like China and Saudi Arabia, which come with their own problems. A, you eventually have to spend more on expensive interest rates on these loans, and B, you are now at the mercy of your creditor countries and institutions. For instance, Pakistan can't dare raise its voice against China on any issue. And the IMF is literally dictating the Pakistani government on how it should run the economy. Autonomy across all segments, political, economic, foreign policy, defense, stands compromised. So what is the IMF telling Pakistan to do this time around? In one word, detoxify. Control government spending, expand the tax base, reduce import tariffs, sell off loss-making state-owned enterprises, reduce current account deficit. Don't drain your forex reserves trying to artificially prop up your exchange rate. Reform the power sector, cut red tape, cut corruption, start taking climate change seriously. Catastrophic floods in 2022 were enough to plunge the economy again into crisis. By the way, these are politically very bitter pills. Cutting subsidies, increasing taxes, keeping interest rates elevated Forcing people to pay more for electricity never going to be popular with people. But to its credit, Pakistan has been swallowing these bitter pills. According to the IMF, the government has been improving its fiscal situation. It has been expanding the scope of its GST, increasing tax compliance, and even taxing agriculture, something totally taboo in India. They've also chucked their version of the MSP system, the minimum support price system. So this time, no wheat procurement in Pakistan. Farmers have to compete in the open market. Elevated levels of interest rates were retained until inflation was brought down. Import duties are being reduced, electricity tariffs have been increased, and they are now looking to restructure this massive stock of circular debt in the power sector. Meanwhile, strong remittances and resilient exports have somewhat stabilized the current account and forex reserves. Pakistan is also committed to strengthen anti-corruption institutions and disinvest their public sector companies. So the IMF is happy with the progress so far, which is why they approved the latest installment of loans despite India's objections. Also, there is a geopolitical aspect involved. Pakistan's long history with the US, its nuclear arsenal, its geography that borders India, China, Afghanistan, and Iran make it too important for the Western powers to let it slide into anarchy. And so, if you look at Pakistan's record in the past IMF programs, Pakistan always starts off earnestly with the reforms, but then somehow the momentum fizzles out, the implementation suffers, and the economy again backpedals into mismanagement. And that's because there's a major problem with the IMF medication. By just focusing on technical economic parameters, the IMF is essentially trying to clean up the mess in the economy caused by poor governance. It's not forcing Pakistan to address the reason of its poor governance, namely its dysfunctional political system, a political system that still remains in the tight grip of the elites and the various vested interests, and most importantly, the multi-tentacled military sitting like a giant octopus in the middle. Without reforming this system, Pakistan may somehow survive this latest crisis, but it's only a matter of time before it stumbles onto another one, because the incentives are always there to subvert the system. After all, if Pakistan's armed forces can't be told to stick to the battleground, then they will eventually turn the economy into one. For more such insights, like, share, and subscribe to The Bond Economist.